each person is made in the image and likeness of God, is unrepeatable, who possesses a dignity that is not given to them by a mandate of the state, but by their very nature. When you understand this is true about all people, without regard to their race, then you can build a society based on that. And I think the American founding, while flawed right from the beginning, nonetheless has the solution to those flaws.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah K. Johnson with the Miles Franklin Market Update. And with us today is Reverend Robert Sirico. He is the author of the book Defending the Free Market, The Moral Case for the Free Economy, and he also runs the Acton Institute. Father Sirico, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Elijah. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. And now, we talked about 4 or 5 months ago, and this was right when the pandemic was starting and things were shutting down. 4 or 5 months later, we see things have reopened. There are still a lot of things shut down here and there, but a lot of things reopened. We've seen the stock market, almost back to the all-time highs. We see the Dow like 1,000 points away from the all-time high. A lot of people are still feeling the effects, obviously, of this crisis. Now, I'd like to start with the economy. Do you think we've seen this V-shaped recovery in the stock market? It seems like that's what happened, but if you look at a lot of different people talking, they're still hurting. So where are we right now with the economy?
I know it's always frustrating to hear this kind of answer to a question, but I think there's I don't think the whole story's been told yet, and I say that for a variety of reasons. The indicators are that there's a lot of hope, especially kind of focused on a vaccine. So I think there's still room for the market to move up. But let me quickly add, I'm not a finance guy. I'm an economist, not a finance guy, and there is a difference. But the rate of gold, which is at historic heights, indicate that there is a troublesome view of the economy as such. People are trying to protect themselves. Likewise with the electronic currencies. And I think those are signs that people are not sure what's the next step. And I think the real cloud on the horizon, and this may be an horizon that's far off, but I think is unavoidable, is the deficit. We have now spent, $4 or $5 trillion in various programs, not all directly related to COVID, though under the enthusiasm and momentum of COVID. And that has to be paid by somebody. It may be, in the next generation where we're going to see that. But I think that's a very troublesome reality to keep in mind.
Now, we talked last time with regard to the centralization of decision making. You talked about how really the best scenario is if people can make the decisions on a local level, but that's really not what we saw during this crisis. Did you want to give an update on that? Because we've seen, 4 or 5 more months since we last talked about a lot of decisions being made at the state level and the government level as well.
Yeah, and then international level even. And I don't know if I don't remember whether I had made this link between the investment of government in healthcare, the investment in government in research, the investment in government in a variety of these areas that touch on the health of a nation, and how in sync all of that was immediately on the response, namely that it would be a central government perspective. And I don't want to make it sound like I don't believe there isn't a role for government in all of this, but when it's the presumption that the government is going to be the solution, and when there are aspects of this question that we are unsure of still. I'm not a skeptic as to the reality of the virus. I know there's some people, have various kinds of theories, but neither do I think this is the end of the world. And I think so. Just in that regard, in regard to the way in which it softened up people to expect and accept the interventions of government, which is very seductive, because when you're offered $600 a week not to work and you're a waitress, I mean, do the numbers. You take the 600 until there's no more money there, and then you go back to work. The problem is, what happens to the business in the meantime? What happens to the clientele in the meantime? So the effects of the government intervention don't just have to do with the direct economic effects, but the psychological effects in society as a whole, the way in which people are more depressed, the suicide rates are up, anyone who is in a profession like mine as a priest who hears confessions, you hear certain themes coming out, kind of inordinate rage, and sometimes a blind rage, just because people have been so confined and being told what to do. All of that kind of works together, that we have to calculate the cost of this thing, not just in terms of the comorbidities and the fatality rates, but also in terms of the economic, and then the psychological, and even, I would say as a priest, spiritual dimensions of this. And I don't think people have kind of grasped the whole picture yet. It's a lot to get your arms around.
It definitely is. And I know in our last interview, you were talking about different ways in which, a lot of bad things were happening, violations of human dignity. For example, priests couldn't even go into hospitals to give last rites and all that. And it's like, it doesn't seem like we're looking really at the whole person. We're just looking at, well, what's going to, just to get the number of maybe deaths down with the virus, but we have to look at the whole picture and the whole person at the same time.
Right. And of course, in the end, the number of deaths weren't as great as we thought they were going to be. If this is, in fact, the end, who knows? The fatality rate was generally focused on certain specific groups of people, not the population as a whole, which isn't to say that we're not concerned about those people, but it is to say that you need to focus on that and not hit this with an elephant gun when you can sharpshoot it. And I think that has been lost because of the bureaucratic mentality, by the way. So I suppose that in most places, the access to people in hospitals by clergy has improved somewhat. But the alarming thing that we should keep in our mind is that ever happened in the first place. That the church, the religious institutions, have been so marginalized from mainstream society that it was seen as an expendable loss, that it was a non-essential service. And I think that is a very narrow way to conceive social reality. It's hegemonic, I may have used the phrase, to a hammer, everything seems like a nail. And that's the way the medical community approached this in some areas.
Definitely. And it seems like, on a psychological level as well. I noticed this myself when I'm, walking down the street and I'm seeing another person coming. It's like, oh, I need to get out of the way. Or I was just at the lake the other day and I see like maybe a group of 10 kids, playing, and I'm like, something's wrong here. It's like, wait a second, what is this? What is this reaction that I'm having to just like the other person? We're human beings, we're built for relationship, we're built for community, but it seems like whether this is intentional or not, it doesn't really matter. It's like the effect of it is that we are now having this negative reaction towards just seeing people.
Right. You haven't become a mask shamer, have you? I've had a few. We're hearing this constantly, so we look and we ask, even if we don't buy it, we respond. But I have had several encounters with mask fascists with regard to the kids in our school, or even a belligerent email that I got because some woman drove by the church and saw the mass let out and people were standing together outside, including the priest. And people generally were not wearing masks because they were outside. There were clusters of people together, but those were largely families. And she wrote this hysterical diatribe on people dying and they're piling up bodies in the hospitals. And that's just not true. It's certainly not here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's not true. And I know it's not true because the chaplain of the hospital system she was referring to lives in my rectory. And I said, are you having a lot of deaths in the hospital? He said, no, not at all. So here's the thing. It's acclimating us to be these little dictators, to think that we have the right to intrude in other people's lives in ways that are not grounded in reality. And your experience of it says a great deal about how we habituate. We keep hearing it, and it just it forms in us a certain reaction.
No, it seems like we're seeing also we talked about last time also about these positive things that are happening as well. It seems like that we can actually respond as a community to this. So did you want to give an update on that? What are some of the positive things we're seeing from this and the way that people are coming together amid this crisis?
Well, I think we have to admit there's a bifurcation, that what I'll describe now are certain specific things, but they are counterbalanced by just the opposite. So I think the suspicion of government, I think most everybody realizes that regardless of the medical reality of this pandemic, there's an awful lot of it, and I think we don't know quite what the percentage is and might not know for a while. There's an awful lot of it that's being manufactured by politics and in one way or another. And I think a good indicator of that will be if after the election, this kind of discussion dissipates. And I suspect that it will because, and why is that the case? That's the case because it's useful. Don't let a crisis go to waste, and so the political operatives who have a mentality of centralized government are going to use this and have used it. So the positive things I see are the suspicion of government, that suspicion that we need to find solutions that are outside of politics, that are outside of bureaucracy, and the repeal of certain restrictions. I think I may have used the example previously of things like hand sanitizers. That whole thing was regulated by some, I don't know what medical bureaucracy it was regulated by and licensed by. But now we have distilleries who are producing this stuff. You remember there was a real concern. We didn't have masks. We didn't have, now we have entrepreneurs that you can get designer masks of all kinds. I heard the other day on the radio, there's a mask that's over $1 million encrusted with diamonds. So this really proves how the market responds to things, even sometimes absurdly.
Definitely. I mean, that's what your whole book is about, is really how the free market can be the solution in a lot of circumstances. It seems like here is another circumstance where it has brought about a whole lot of solutions. I wanted to turn our focus now to, there's a lot of protests going on in the country, a lot of protests that are turning into riots, and people are wondering, what is going on? And obviously there are a lot of important issues that the protests are addressing and stuff like that. And you actually had experience in Grand Rapids where you are. There were protests and riots just really close to where you were. And there was also a lot of positivity afterwards with the community coming together and all of that. So how should people look at what's going on right now?
Well, let me relate that story. There was shortly after Mr. Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, there was a prayer vigil and a protest in the central square in Grand Rapids called Rosa Parks Square. And when that was done, people marched to the police station, and all of a sudden, bricks began being thrown. Stores were broken into and looted. All along, the Secretary of State's office was there, the police station was there, and of course, the Acton Institute is just 2 blocks from that. And these folks kept going up the street and began breaking into a clothing shop near us. Next door to us, there's a Mexican restaurant, and that was destroyed, the glass. They threw a heavy planter that was on the steps of the Acton Institute, picked it up and threw it at our window. But when we designed the Acton Institute, I told the architects that I wanted bulletproof glass, because I knew, the kind of ideas we represent don't sit well with some folks. So it didn't go through the window. It just bounced back, thank goodness. The next day, so that was on a Saturday night. The next day I got up and I had early morning mass, but I went down earlier than the mass. So at about 7 o'clock in the morning, I went down just to kind of go and see the Acton building and see the place where the police cars were burned. And there were people out on Sunday morning cleaning it up. And this was not organized. It was multicultural, all different kinds of people. There were also people bringing down pizza and coffee and different things. And within a day, that whole area, I drove right by where the police cars had burned. I'd seen it on the news, and it was cleaned up. I mean, you could see the burn marks on the ground. And that showed a community coming together for a purpose that is good, that builds, that fructifies. Here's my just 2 points I'd like to make about this whole thing in a general moral and philosophical sense. The first is that racism is real. I think it does not serve to equivocate and to say very clearly that particularly African Americans in this country, though not exclusively, particularly African American men in this country, though not exclusively, have been the victims of all kinds of harassment, whether it's lynching or excessive police force or just neighbors being vile or even sometimes subtle in their racism. We need to acknowledge that reality and the need for that to change. I believe the same kind of spirit that animated those people to clean up the mess that were on the streets of Grand Rapids, when you have a community that shares a common sense of itself, that the mess of racism can also be cleared up. But the second thing I want to say is that not everybody protesting has good intentions or clear understanding of what the problem is. The repudiation on the part of various movements, including Black Lives Matter, including the 1619 or 1626, I've forgotten the movement to kind of rewrite American history through the lens of institutional racism, and making many historical errors in the process of that these movements that want to repudiate the American founding and the Constitution of the United States are setting up the scenario whereby this stuff will continue and worsen and deepen and divide and destroy in the image of these riots, rather than the community that flourishes, that takes care, that cleans up messes, that changes and responds to the moral imperative of having a society that is virtuous. So I think these two things need to be kept in mind. Black lives do matter. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Black lives matter because human life matters. And when you understand why human life matters, why each person is made in the image and likeness of God, is unrepeatable, who possesses a dignity that is not given to them by a mandate of the state, but by their very nature. When you understand this is true about all people, without regard to their race, then you can build a society based on that. And I think the American founding, while flawed right from the beginning, nonetheless has the solution to those flaws.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and such a perspective that is like refreshing, because it's not coming from, any political ideology or anything. It's coming from the human, the dignity of the human person. I think it circles right back again to what we were talking about this pandemic and all this. It's like we have to keep that in mind, is the dignity of every single human person. And yeah, it's just so great and so refreshing to hear such a perspective that's not coming from, any political ideology or anything like that, but it's just looking at, okay, we're all human here. Let's just treat each other with respect. Well, Father Sirico, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Elijah.
Yeah. Where can people find you online if they'd like to learn more, and how can they get your book?
Acton.org, ACTON.org. A lot of videos and a whole library of materials and conferences and everything. And you can order my book on there too, or at Amazon and all of the other places you order books.
Father Sirico, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Great to be with you. God bless.